In our last DCM episode with Sylvia Mayer and the ABCs of Making Connections, I promised you that we were going to bring you a unique perspective through the works of Karen Tibbals. Now, Karen is not a dispute resolution enthusiast like some of our other guests, but instead comes from an extensive career in the field of marketing. Yes, marketing. And what other field knows how to convince people to do things, right? Well, during Karen's career, she actually was an expert in consumer behavior. And so she oftentimes bridged the gap between what consumers were looking for and what they valued and what the organizations were trying to sell. So she brings that perspective to us today. Not only is she going to share some key insights from her extensive experience, but she's also gone on to study the field of religion and the various values brought forth in religion and ties that to our human behavior today. So stay tuned, and if you want to be notified of future episodes, please subscribe. We've got a lot going ahead in 2022. Today, another exciting adventure in decoding the conflict mindset. And I am so excited to have this guest speaker because Karen Tibbals comes to us with an extensive marketing background in the pharmaceutical world and served as an expert in consumer behavior. And so we hope to get some keen insights from Karen and explore, just what our world is all about and the political divide that we deal with in every walk of life. So welcome, Karen. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, great. And, it's interesting where you end up meeting people, but Karen and I met just a few weeks ago on a speakers Playhouse program and put out a call for guest speakers. And so it's very exciting to have you here with us today. Because, with decoding the conflict mindset, the whole intent is to help expand our awareness worldwide and just understanding some of the drivers, some of the triggers, some of the forces that shape our behavior, shape our mindset when we are confronted with conflict and what we can then do about it. And so, I'm looking forward to traveling this road with you here today, Karen. And, aside from your extensive marketing and consumer behavior expertise, I know that you've written a number of books and articles.
Yes. And I got there because I left my career to go back to school for a degree in religion, which, is, out of the box and kind of weird. But what happened is when I was there, I found this theory that I just was enthralled with, moral foundation theory by Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham. And it just changed the way I looked at the world. And here I thought I was a consumer behavior expert, and I didn't understand this part of it. And when I did, it just, like I said, it blew my mind.
Wow.
And then I started telling people what I understood the theory meant and how it applied to various parts of our lives and understanding what was going on. And they're going, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And so that's why I started writing the books, because I just have a really in-depth, an in-depth understanding of how the theories can be applied and how they can help us in everyday life.
Wow, amazing. I have to admit that when I was an undergrad, the religious studies ended up being one of my most favorite classes. Just interesting to learn the different viewpoints and beliefs systems behind the different religions that exist. And so I appreciate where you're coming from on that one. So, well, tell us a little bit about, when we talk about conflict, the things that we fight about, your whole topic is around persuade, don't preach, and really taking a look at restoring civility across the political divide. And so talk to us a little bit more about some of the values that sort of underlie, what we fight about.
So one of the important points that I don't think people really think about when they, a lot of people have heard of moral foundations theory, but they kind of pass it by. They think it's an interesting curiosity. But what they don't really think about that I think is so important is that we need to separate the person from the position they take from the issues and from the values that are underneath those positions. And once we understand the values that are underneath their positions, we need to do work to appreciate what those values are and what they bring to the conversation, because maybe we've been ignoring something that's important. Because we all have the same 5 basic moral foundations. That's part of being human. And I'll throw in my religious part. That's part of how God made us. And so we need to honor those values. And we need to talk about the values. And if we start talking about the values, then we can probably come to a better conclusion, because we'll honor all parts of being human.
Well, that's fascinating. I appreciate you going back to the 5 basic values, and you stated something that I refer to a lot too, particularly as a mediator working with people in conflict, is that it is important to separate the person from the problem, and not attack the person as a whole, but then look at the elements of whatever the divide or conflict is. And I oftentimes like to say our differences are not deficiencies. They're simply different. But too often we look at people who are different from us as less than, far more so than looking up to people who are different from us. And so I really appreciate what you had to say about that. And the other thing too, and this takes me to my next question, is I oftentimes use the analogy of an iceberg. I believe, in my experience throughout my years of working with people on many different levels, that we oftentimes react to each other above the waterline, the tip of the iceberg, what we see, what we hear, and what's being said. But we seldom have the courage and curiosity to go below the waterline into all of those things below that represent our beliefs, our expectations, our attitudes, our concerns, our hopes, our values, our fears, our needs. And so what do you think gets in the way of why people don't go there?
I think that, first of all, that people have a hard time listening. I also think that we look for things to disagree with because of our negative mindset. And also, just values are invisible to us. They're like the air that we breathe, or if we were a fish, the water that we swim in. We just take them for granted and we don't think about them. I find that when I name a value that somebody is using, they really appreciate that I've named that and appreciating it. It makes such a huge difference in the conversation when I can do that.
And I'm curious, I have a way of how I open up those kinds of opportunities, pulling out the nuggets from what somebody's trying to say. How do you open up your conversation when you recognize a value that's important to somebody?
I'll say, when I'm responding to what somebody has said, I'm saying, I think what I'm hearing in there is, and I'll name, is that a degree of belonging community. Now, I've named them differently than Height's name. He uses loyalty to the group, and I just have this visceral negative reaction to that. But I think that belonging to a group is a really important part of life. And I wanted to highlight what I thought were the crucial parts of it, which are belonging to the group and community, because we all want community. We just look at it. The problem is that it looks differently for different people. And so we don't recognize what's going on underneath is the same thing as what we want. So I'll just name it in my words because I like my words better.
Well, very good, very good. Well, inclusion, which is part of what you're talking about, as far as being part of a community, is a huge piece of who we are as human beings. And I think a lot of people don't realize that we are hardwired in a way to look for the negative, because that's part of our drive to survive, to be on the watch for what we might fight about, what we might flee from, or simply what will immobilize us sometimes. And so fear is a huge driver, but it's often steeped then in the negative rather than seeking out the positive. And it really takes a courageous mindset again to really go there, in my opinion.
Yeah, I've had to work really hard to start saying, I see what you're saying. I agree with you. That's a good point. Those are phrases that I've really tried to work into my vocabulary, instead of arguing the one little thing that I disagreed with, to find what the commonalities are first. And that really has helped in my conversations
Great, great. I oftentimes like to use the word perspective. I mean, even just now I use the word opinion, which I don't use very often, quite honestly. And I like to use perspective because it's just a matter of seeing things differently. And so what can I learn from you by listening to your perspective? Whether or not I agree with it or like it, what can I learn? Because you do see things differently. And again, if we can go open up the mindset and use that courage and curiosity, I think we can have some pretty powerful conversations. What do you do when there is some open differences or disagreement, something you don't agree with? How do you find yourself handling that in ways that don't fuel the fire? But
so since I started working since I finished the book, I've been talking to groups about the book and about the concepts behind it. And as I've been doing it, I've been finding other people doing similar work. And I started putting together a newsletter of other ways you could do it besides just the one thing that I'm recommending, which I'll get to in a minute. And so I've developed this system that I talk about in the newsletter, and it will be in a forthcoming book shortly. And it starts with asking questions, listening, affirming, saying something positive, finding a point of agreement, or that naming the value and agreeing that value is important, and then finally responding. And the responding can be in a number of different ways. It can be stories, which are very important, but it can also be in the way that I talk about in my book, Persuade, Don't Preach, where you take the value or a related value that the other person would appreciate, and use that in what you're talking about. I'll give you an example. So when I give my talk, I use an example, a talk I had with one of my aunts, my last living aunt, and I was on a visit to her, and she had an immigrant caregiver who was sitting in the room with us. There were 3 of us in the room. And my aunt started going off on a rant about immigration and how we shouldn't allow immigrants in this country. And Jeannie, her caregiver, is sitting in the same room. And I got really upset and I didn't know what to do. And so I called her rude and I walked out. I didn't have the skills. I didn't know what to do. And so last time I saw her, she died about a year later. What I wished I could have done now is to do what I just talked about. And let me give you an example of what I could have done. I could have said, Aunt Dot, are you saying that because you care about this country so much? Because I think she was probably referencing the value of belonging to this country. Ask the question. And then listen, obviously. No sense in asking a question if I'm not going to listen. But it's hard. It's hard. And then agree, yes, Aunt Dot, I think this country is important, that it's important for us to protect this country. I have gotten a lot of benefit from being in this country, all things that I think are true. And then take a value that I think might have been important to her and say, what about immigrants who work hard? Should they be allowed in this country? How about immigrants like your caregiver, Jeannie? Now, I don't know whether I would have changed her mind, but I think I would have had a better shot at it than what I did, which is nothing. And so I kind of put the 2 things that I've been working on together, the system of asking, listening, affirming, and responding, together with using the values as one of the ways to respond. And I think that's a very effective way to talk to people who you otherwise would have a hard time talking to.
Yes, and I really love how your stories, when we learn best from stories quite oftentimes, but I love how your story really illustrates the title of your newsletter, Mending Fractured Relationships, because that's what happened, right? Your relationship ended and now she's no longer here. So I imagine that must feel like a real significant loss for you.
Yes, but I had hardened my heart to it because I was so mad at her. And it's taken the work that I'm doing now to really understand what a big loss it was and how terrible I feel that I did that, and that I didn't have the skills. And this is some way of making amends.
Yeah. You you triggered a thought in my mind too, as far as how you were so angry about it, that your anger fueled your behavior, that again contributed to the breakdown in the relationship. And so we've already talked about fear being a huge driver behind behavior, but anger is also. And I oftentimes like to share with people, it's okay to get angry, but it's how you display it, how you show it, and the impact you have on other people that could break down relationships. And so holding on to anger over past things really ends up harming you as the holder of the anger more than it does the recipient that you're directing your anger towards. And so I use that as a way of encouraging people to let's move on. How can we grow from this experience rather than staying stuck in this experience? And just really helping people, again, decode what's going on for them so that they can find meaning and value in something new and more healthy, or healthier and happier.
Yeah, we lose so much. And we learn and grow in relationships. As Jonathan Haidt says, that when we cut off relationships, we become stupid. Because we need to hear different points of view. We need to learn and grow, and we can't do that if we just cut off the people that we don't agree with. I don't know if you know Peter Coleman out of Columbia University, but he talks about how in his research that we can come to agreement. Most people can come to agreement on things if they recognize beforehand that the issues are complicated, and that if we think about all the nuances of the situation, we can find a lot of stuff to agree on. And, maybe there's a few points we don't agree on, but we agree that we don't agree on those points. But instead and social media is at least partially to blame for this, that we simplify things instead of talking about the nuances. And also because we focus on the negative and the differences. So if we can focus on the commonalities and the points and the nuance, and become curious, as you said, we can come to a pretty strong agreement on most things.
Yeah, that is so important. I mean, that's one of the key premises in using a mediation approach, is to help parties identify their common interest as well as recognize their different interests. And so by doing that, then it serves as a foundation for identifying then possible solutions for resolution and helping them, because when people are in conflict, they're at odds. And so if we can help identify where they actually share some common interests or concerns or values, then we're shifting the mindset to move them towards agreement. And then they can more realistically look at the differences. And when done artfully and skillfully, it's amazing how parties will then start suggesting solutions for the other person once they identify, what their different needs are. And so It's really a powerful experience. And so I like, mending fractured relationships is a really good term for that, because that's one thing about mediation that I love so much, is that even the small percentage, less than 10%, when they don't reach agreement, people oftentimes report a very high degree of satisfaction with the process.
Wow.
To talk about their differences and concerns in ways that are safe. Psychological safety is part of what we do in mediation. And they feel that they can actually go where they might not have gone because their efforts to do so in the past have not been successful. They've just shut the relationship off, like you did with your aunt. Yeah.
And then where I'm going next with this, which I'm just starting to work on now, is how this applies to the business world. Because I think that, having come from a long career in the business world, I understand how people think. And, there's an emphasis on being very rational, and, it has to make sense. It has to make money. It has to, you can't do something if it doesn't make sense. But then you run into issues that your customers or your suppliers or various stakeholders have a very strong opinion, and you run into roadblocks. And how can you think through those issues so that you get ahead of that and you don't let that become a roadblock to you because you've thought about it ahead of time? And so I'm working on a book that's tentatively titled Stakeholder Strategy, that would go through a process for how to apply this way of thinking about the moral foundation theory and how it applies and what your various stakeholders and how they feel about it and how you can use that in your decision making.
Oh, okay. That's very exciting to hear. So do you have a targeted time frame for when this might be published?
Probably the end of the year.
Yeah. Coming from a marketing background, one notion I will hear from people is that they feel marketing is sometimes manipulative. And I'm curious to hear your take on that as far as, what we've been talking about today and how to shape and influence people differently. I know how I think about it, but I'd like to have your take on that since you actually come from the field and have an MBA.
Yes, I do. I have an MBA in marketing. I think that what marketing does is it amplifies what's already there. Okay. If it isn't already there, it can't be amplified. Now, is it right that it's amplified? Not always. But generally, marketing is about meeting people's needs, making sure that what you do is consistent with their needs. And that was my focus in my career, was I viewed myself as the voice of the customer to the company and to ensure that what they did was consistent. I remember one time when they wanted to do something because they misunderstood what was important to the customer. And, I had to go to the mat and say, that's not right for them. You won't be successful. I mean, it's not right for the customer, but you're also not going to be successful if you misunderstand what the customer is about. So good marketing, a lot of what people don't like about marketing is bad marketing. And a lot of what people don't like about marketing is sales. That's not marketing. Yeah. So, but do I think all marketing is good? No, not all marketing is good, but there is good marketing.
Yeah. Well, hand in glove with that one too, because I know, many times people feel that way about psychology too, and thinking that, we're using what we know about people to manipulate them. And yet that's, not my mindset at all. Instead, it's how to influence people to a happier mindset and not riddled with conflict and not riddled with, damaged relationships or broken hearts and it's really a healing process. And so I think our messages align very closely in that. So Karen, again, you're such an accomplished writer. And, again, we met through the Speakers Playhouse. And I'm curious to learn from you as far as what really sparked your interest in doing speaking and what kinds of events do you have coming up where people might, find out more about you, attend, reach out and connect with you.
Great. Well, on my website, there's a box you can sign up for, either contact me or sign up for the newsletter, Mending Fractured Relationships. That's an important thing. Please sign up for the newsletter. I think it's so important for people to get these tips. I do speaking engagements at many churches. I do them at community groups. I did one for Civility first in Whidbey Island in state of Washington. Everything's on my website, so that's up to date. And I'm looking for more because I think this is an important message that people need to hear. You'll hear about the story of my aunt, and you'll hear more about the techniques about how you can use these in everyday life. Okay. And then I love answering questions. Okay. So please send me questions. And I love the stories too. So the stories on the website, there's a way to give me your stories. And sometimes I use them in my newsletter, and I have a story there from somebody who was trying to talk to a neighbor, but he was drinking, he was probably drunk, and how could she have done differently? And, so I try to make it real. Okay, great. And your website again is? PersuadeDon'tPreach.com. Okay, very good. I just wanted to clarify because I know you have a website for your fractured relationships as well, right? Yes. There's a link to the newsletter on the PersuadeDon'tPreach.com. So everything is on there. And also importantly, there's a section of the website for resources, for other things that you can get and do. Oh, and I offer a discussion guide for if you want to have a book study group. I've had a couple of groups do this, and they found it really, really helped. I have lots of questions that I developed as I was working with this, because I was looking at my own behavior. And that's part of what we need to do when we think about how we're going to change our behaviors, to think about ourselves and what's going on with us. So then we can start to see other people more clearly. And that's been very important in my journey.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. One of the things I'm hearing out of your message too, and as you mentioned, working with the business community, I do a lot of reading and researching and designing programs for today's workplace. And, we're going into a very different period of time in our history, given the events of 2020 and 2021, and you mentioned earlier, the political divide and how it's encroaching into the workplace, and more and more, one of the fastest rising corporate level positions has been around diversity and inclusion and addressing civility in the workplace, and so there's a lot of work to be done out there. And it is an important message to get out there.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the research has shown that the programs that are being done right now on diversity really haven't been effective. I believe what the research shows is that, it makes an impact on certain people, but it wears off, and certain people have like a negative reaction to it. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there to implement new programs that can have a more lasting effect. And I think work on moral foundation theory can help inform, particularly those people who are having a negative reaction to the current diversity work, because the research shows that people on one side of the political divide versus the other use different parts of their brain. And if you're using a different part of your brain, it doesn't matter what the words are. You have to do something else, and figuring out what that else is I think a challenge, and I'm hoping that the work that I'm doing will help inform that, especially with the understanding of moral foundation theory, because I think if you use a value that's important to the person, you could change it, the conversation.
Well, one thing I'm hearing from you is that, you mentioned the word listen already. And I always like to say listening means not just, being silent in your brain, but also silent what comes out of your mouth, and vice versa. And by listening, then you can really pull out those gems of values that are important to people, and at least acknowledge them, even if you don't agree with them. And that's where, I really see the potential for, bringing civility into our conversations and really have meaningful explorations about similarities and differences. And in that way, we can really build a stronger framework for our workplaces, our humankind ahead. So, Karen, I've been so delighted to have you here. What a rich and deep conversation. And I look forward to looking into your Mending Fractured Relationships newsletter as well. And so thank you again, Karen. And for, again, our listeners and viewers, if you enjoyed this episode of Decoding the Conflict Mindset, sign up and be ready for the next one coming up, because you will continue to learn how to decode the conflict mindset. Share it on social media, invite your friends, and it's all about civility in our lives. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Well, if that was interesting, wait until our next guest coming up, Lily Basilev. Lily comes to us with a mediation background, but from a different perspective. She is a certified divorce financial analyst and helped actually found that whole industry as it relates to divorce. What I really enjoyed about the interview with Lily is she talks about the dirty little secrets of financial infidelity. We oftentimes think about the marital or the emotional, the relationship aspects of infidelity, but we seldom pay attention to the many different little ways that people may be actually committing financial infidelity and not even realize it. So listen and learn, don't go away. If you aren't already subscribed, subscribe now so that you get first notification of our next episode with financial extraordinaire and mediator Lily Bassel. You won't want to miss this one. It's really good.